There exists a profound hypocrisy at the heart of progressive politics that I've witnessed countless times throughout my years working in Britain's public hospitals and prisons. The very people who speak most eloquently about social justice, who champion the cause of the downtrodden with such passionate rhetoric, often display the most callous indifference toward the actual poor when encountered in real life. This contradiction isn't merely philosophical, it has devastating practical consequences for those trapped in cycles of dependency and despair. In my decades of treating patients from society's margins, I've observed how the wealthy liberals' version of compassion creates a systematic cruelty that would shock even the most hardened conservative. The poor become props in their moral theater, useful for signaling virtue but disposable when genuine human connection is required. This isn't accidental. It's the inevitable result of replacing authentic charity with political sentimentalism. Chapter 1: The Virtue Signaling Theater, When Compassion Becomes Performance. In my experience treating patients in Birmingham's inner-city hospitals, I encountered numerous middle-class professionals who volunteered in soup kitchens and homeless shelters, eager to display their compassion. Yet when these same individuals found themselves sharing waiting rooms with the actual poor, the unwashed, the mentally ill, the inarticulate, their behavior revealed a different truth entirely. They would clutch their designer handbags tighter, move seats to avoid contact, and speak in hushed tones about the unfortunate circumstances that brought such people to their condition. I recall one particularly illuminating incident involving a wealthy barrister's wife who served on the board of a homelessness charity. When her teenage daughter required emergency treatment after a drug overdose, she demanded private facilities and expressed horror at the prospect of her child being treated alongside those people, the very demographic she claimed to champion. The irony was lost on her completely. This pattern repeated endlessly. Progressive politicians who sent their children to elite private schools while condemning school choice for others, wealthy activists who lived in gated communities while advocating for mass immigration, liberal academics who spoke passionately about income inequality from their tenured positions while employing undocumented workers at below minimum wages. The poor served as convenient abstractions for their moral posturing, but any actual contact with poverty's reality triggered immediate flight to the safety of their privileged enclaves. The most disturbing aspect wasn't their hypocrisy. All humans are hypocritical to some degree, but their complete lack of self-awareness about it. They had convinced themselves that their political positions constituted genuine compassion, absolving them of any obligation for direct charitable action or personal sacrifice. Voting for the correct candidate became a substitute for actual engagement with human suffering, allowing them to maintain their moral superiority while avoiding the messiness of real poverty. Chapter 2: The Pathology of Privileged Guilt, How Good Intentions Create Bad Outcomes. The psychological mechanism driving wealthy liberal behavior toward the poor reveals itself most clearly in their treatment of crime and criminals. Throughout my years as a prison psychiatrist, I witnessed countless examples of middle-class reformers whose misguided compassion perpetuated the very conditions they claimed to oppose. Their approach to criminal behavior demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature, rooted in their own comfortable distance from crime's consequences. These well-meaning progressives consistently advocated for reduced sentences, alternative punishments, and rehabilitation programs that sounded enlightened in theory but proved disastrous in practice. They spoke eloquently about the root causes of crime, poverty, lack of opportunity, societal racism, while completely ignoring the immediate causes, personal choices, moral failures, and the absence of consequences for destructive behavior. Their analysis always stopped short of holding individuals accountable for their actions. I observed this pattern repeatedly when affluent liberals visited prisons as part of reform initiatives. They would listen sympathetically to inmates' sob stories, nod knowingly about systemic injustice, and advocate for early release programs. Yet when these same criminals were freed and inevitably re-offended, often victimizing people from their own communities, these same reformers experienced no personal consequences. Their children attended private schools in safe neighborhoods, their families lived behind security systems in wealthy suburbs, their property was protected by private security and comprehensive insurance. The poor, meanwhile, bore the full cost of this misguided compassion. They lived in the neighborhoods where released criminals returned to prey upon former victims. They sent their children to public schools where violence was tolerated in the name of understanding troubled youth. They worked in shops and lived in housing projects where crime was dismissed as an inevitable consequence of social conditions rather than punished as the moral choice it actually was. This dynamic created a perverse incentive structure where the wealthy could afford to be generous with other people's safety while remaining insulated from the consequences of their generosity. Their guilt about their own privilege manifested as policies that harmed the very people they purported to help, creating a cycle where good intentions consistently produced bad outcomes for society's most vulnerable members. Chapter 3: The Language of Evasion: How Euphemisms Hide Elite Cruelty. One of the most insidious ways wealthy liberals demonstrate their actual attitudes toward the poor is through their careful manipulation of language. During my medical career, I observed how progressive elites consistently employed euphemisms and technical jargon to distance themselves from the human reality of poverty while maintaining their self-image as compassionate advocates. This linguistic sleight of hand allowed them to discuss the poor as categories rather than individuals, abstractions rather than fellow human beings. Consider how they transformed illegitimate children into alternative family structures, removing any suggestion that fathers abandoning their offspring might constitute moral failure. This wasn't merely political correctness, it reflected a deeper unwillingness to acknowledge that their policies encouraging single motherhood through welfare dependency had devastating consequences for actual children. By changing the language, they could avoid confronting the evidence that fatherless families consistently produced higher rates of poverty, crime, and educational failure. Similarly, the transformation of criminals into justice-involved individuals and drug addicts into people with substance use disorders served to obscure personal agency and moral responsibility. These weren't neutral scientific terms. They were ideological constructs designed to prevent clear thinking about causation and accountability. When language becomes deliberately imprecise, clear diagnosis becomes impossible, and without accurate diagnosis, effective treatment remains out of reach. I witnessed this linguistic manipulation most clearly in hospital settings, where middle-class administrators and social workers would spend considerable time crafting reports that obscured rather than illuminated their patients' actual conditions. A violent drug addict who terrorized staff and other patients became someone experiencing housing insecurity and medication compliance challenges. A teenage mother with multiple children by different fathers became a young woman facing reproductive health decisions in a complex social environment. This euphemistic language served multiple functions for its practitioners. It allowed them to feel sophisticated and compassionate while avoiding the discomfort of moral judgment. It provided professional cover for policies that consistently failed to help their supposed beneficiaries. Most importantly, it created a barrier between themselves and the human reality of poverty, allowing them to maintain their comfortable distance while claiming moral authority. The poor themselves understood this dynamic perfectly. They quickly learned to adopt the approved language when seeking services, telling social workers and therapists exactly what they wanted to hear about systemic oppression and environmental factors. Meanwhile, in private conversations, they expressed far more traditional views about personal responsibility, hard work, and moral behavior, views that would horrify their progressive advocates. Chapter 4: The Welfare State as Class Control: How Help Becomes Harm. The welfare system represents perhaps the most dramatic example of how wealthy liberal compassion transforms into systematic cruelty toward the poor. Throughout my decades treating patients dependent on government assistance, I observed how the supposedly generous benefits system actually functioned as a sophisticated mechanism of social control, keeping the poor dependent, demoralized, and politically useful to their progressive champions. The architects of this system, invariably well-educated professionals from comfortable backgrounds, designed programs that would horrify them if applied to their own families. They created a benefit structure that penalized marriage, discouraged work, and rewarded irresponsible reproduction. They established bureaucracies that treated recipients as children incapable of making adult decisions about their own lives. They implemented regulations that destroyed savings incentives and punished any attempt at economic advancement. I treated countless women who understood perfectly that marrying their children's fathers would result in reduced benefits, forcing them to choose between financial security and family stability. I counseled young men who recognized that taking legitimate employment would cost them more in lost benefits than they could gain in wages, creating rational incentives for remaining unemployed. I spoke with teenagers who calculated that having children would provide both social status and economic support in communities where traditional paths to adulthood had been systematically destroyed. The middle-class professionals administering these programs never faced such choices themselves. Their marriages enhanced rather than threatened their economic security. Their employment provided not just income but professional identity, social connections, and personal fulfillment. Their children were assets rather than sources of government payments. They lived in communities where traditional values still functioned because they could afford to maintain them. Yet these same professionals consistently advocated for expanding the very programs that trapped their clients in cycles of dependency. They interpreted any criticism of welfare's perverse incentives as heartless cruelty toward the disadvantaged. They dismissed evidence of welfare's destructive effects as right-wing propaganda or blamed continuing problems on insufficient funding rather than fundamental design flaws. This willful blindness served their psychological and political needs perfectly. The welfare system provided them with a permanent class of grateful dependents who would reliably vote for expanded government programs. It offered meaningful career opportunities in social services, public administration, and advocacy organizations. Most importantly, it allowed them to feel morally superior to conservatives while avoiding any personal sacrifice or risk. The poor paid the price for this elaborate charade with their dignity, their families, and their futures. They became human props in a political theater where their actual well-being mattered less than their usefulness as symbols of progressive compassion. Chapter 5: Educational Apartheid: How Progressive Schools Fail the Poor. The educational policies championed by wealthy liberals reveal perhaps the starkest contradiction between their stated values and actual behavior. In my years treating families from disadvantaged backgrounds, I observed how progressive educational theories consistently failed the children most in need of rigorous academic instruction, while the architects of these policies ensured their own children attended institutions that maintained traditional standards. Consider the fashionable doctrine of culturally responsive pedagogy that dominated education schools during my career. This approach essentially argued that expecting poor children, particularly minority children, to master standard academic content represented cultural imperialism. Instead of demanding high achievement, schools should validate students' existing cultural knowledge and communication styles. Grammar corrections became acts of linguistic prejudice. Disciplinary standards were dismissed as manifestations of white supremacy. Academic rigor was condemned as exclusionary. I witnessed the devastating consequences of this educational malpractice in countless young patients whose illiteracy and innumeracy had condemned them to lives of frustration and failure. They had been told throughout their schooling that their authentic voices were valuable, that traditional academic skills represented oppressive cultural standards, that their struggles with reading and mathematics reflected systemic bias rather than educational neglect. They graduated, if they graduated at all, functionally illiterate but filled with resentment against a society that allegedly refused to value their contributions. Meanwhile, The progressive educators promoting these theories sent their own children to elite private schools that maintained rigorous academic standards, extensive homework requirements, and strict disciplinary codes. They understood perfectly that their children needed mastery of standard English, mathematical competence, and broad cultural literacy to succeed in professional careers. They simply refused to extend the same benefits to other people's children. The most cynical aspect of this educational apartheid was how it was marketed as social justice. Demanding less of poor children was presented as respecting their cultural backgrounds. Lowering standards was described as making education more inclusive. Abandoning phonics instruction in favor of whole language approaches was promoted as honoring diverse learning styles, even though research consistently demonstrated that systematic phonics instruction was essential for children from non-reading households. I treated numerous parents who intuitively understood that their children were being shortchanged by these progressive approaches but lacked the cultural capital to challenge professional educators. They wanted their children to master the same skills that wealthy children learned, but they were told that such expectations reflected internalized oppression or false consciousness. Their children's academic failures were attributed to poverty, racism, or family dysfunction, anything except the school's systematic refusal to provide effective instruction. Chapter 6: The Charity Industrial Complex, When Helping Becomes a Business. The modern charity sector reveals another dimension of how wealthy liberal compassion toward the poor becomes institutionalized indifference. Throughout my medical career, I encountered numerous charitable organizations that claimed to serve the disadvantaged while primarily serving the career and psychological needs of their educated, middle-class staff. These institutions created elaborate bureaucracies around poverty that consumed vast resources while producing minimal improvements in the lives of their supposed beneficiaries. I observed this dynamic most clearly in organizations addressing homelessness, where highly paid executives earned six-figure salaries managing programs that kept homeless individuals in permanent states of subsidized dependency. These charities had no incentive to actually solve homelessness. Their funding, their jobs, and their social status depended on the persistence of the problem they ostensibly addressed. Success would eliminate their reason for existence, so they developed sophisticated methods for managing rather than eliminating poverty. The language these organizations employed revealed their true priorities. They spoke of wraparound services, holistic approaches, and meeting clients where they are euphemisms for avoiding the demanding work of actually helping people change destructive behaviors. They held endless conferences about best practices and evidence-based interventions, while their clients remained trapped in cycles of addiction, criminality, and despair. I recall one particularly revealing encounter with a homelessness advocate who earned over $200,000 annually managing a shelter system that warehoused rather than rehabilitated its residents. When I suggested that requiring sobriety and job seeking as conditions for continued residence might encourage positive change, she responded with horror about imposing middle-class values and criminalizing poverty. Yet this same woman lived in an expensive suburb, sent her children to private schools, and would never tolerate in her own neighborhood the behaviors she enabled in the shelter. The charity workers I encountered consistently demonstrated what I came to recognize as professional compassion, a performance of caring that satisfied their emotional needs while avoiding the genuine human engagement that might actually help their clients. They preferred working with poverty as an abstract social problem rather than engaging with poor people as individuals capable of moral agency and personal growth. This institutionalization of charity created perverse incentives throughout the system. Organizations competed for grants based on the number of people they served rather than the number they successfully helped escape poverty. They developed elaborate metrics for measuring inputs, meals served, beds provided, counseling sessions conducted, while avoiding any meaningful assessment of outcomes. They created career paths that rewarded expanding problems rather than solving them. The poor understood this dynamic perfectly. They learned to navigate multiple charitable bureaucracies, telling each organization exactly what it wanted to hear while avoiding the genuine behavioral changes that might improve their circumstances. They became professional clients, skilled at accessing services while remaining dependent on them. Chapter 7: The Path Forward: Authentic Charity versus Political Sentimentalism. After decades of observing how progressive compassion consistently harms those it purports to help, I've come to understand that genuine charity requires something wealthy liberals find almost impossible to provide: actual respect for the poor as moral agents capable of making better choices. This respect manifests not in lowered expectations or endless excuses, but in the demanding work of holding people accountable while providing them with genuine opportunities for improvement. Authentic charity begins with honest diagnosis rather than comfortable euphemisms. It acknowledges that poverty in wealthy societies is predominantly behavioral rather than material, caused more by destructive choices than insufficient resources. It recognizes that helping people change self-destructive patterns requires the difficult work of challenging their rationalizations and excuses rather than validating their victim narratives. I witnessed examples of effective charity throughout my career, invariably operated by people who combine genuine compassion with clear moral standards. These organizations demanded sobriety, honesty, and effort from their clients while providing the support necessary for success. They understood that dignity comes from achievement and responsibility, not from unconditional acceptance of dysfunction. The most successful programs I observed were often run by people who had themselves escaped poverty or addiction, bringing personal understanding of the attitudes and behaviors that perpetuate these conditions. They refused to accept excuses precisely because they cared enough to demand better. They combined high expectations with practical assistance, creating environments where positive change became both possible and necessary. This approach requires abandoning the political usefulness of the poor as symbols of social injustice and treating them as individuals capable of moral growth. It means replacing the bureaucratic management of poverty with the personal engagement of genuine charity. It demands the courage to confront destructive behaviors rather than enabling them through misguided tolerance. The wealthy liberals who dominate charitable institutions resist this approach because it threatens both their psychological comfort and their political narratives. Holding the poor accountable for their choices would undermine claims about systemic oppression. Expecting behavioral change would challenge theories about environmental determinism. Demanding personal responsibility would contradict decades of progressive ideology about the root causes of social problems. Yet this demanding approach represents the only path toward genuine liberation from the cycles of dependency that trap so many people in poverty. It requires treating the poor with the same respect we show our own children, combining love with expectations, support with accountability, compassion with clear moral standards. Anything less represents not kindness but a subtle form of contempt that assumes some people are incapable of leading decent, productive lives. Conclusion. The tragedy of wealthy liberal attitudes toward the poor lies not in their lack of good intentions, but in their inability to translate those intentions into policies that actually help rather than harm. Their compassion remains abstract and political rather than personal and practical, allowing them to maintain their moral superiority while avoiding the difficult work of genuine charity. Until they develop the courage to treat the poor as moral equals capable of better choices, their efforts will continue producing the systematic cruelty they mistake for kindness. The poor deserve better than to serve as props in progressive moral theater. They deserve the respect that comes from high expectations and genuine accountability.